Preface: The Fall of Rome. In the annals of history, few names resonate with the weight of meaning as the name Rome. It stands not only as a city but as the embodiment of human ambition, faith, and power. For centuries, Rome was the heart of an empire that spanned continents, a beacon of civilization, law, and the divine. The grandeur of its marble columns, the sacred silence of its temples, and the distant echoes of imperial triumphs remain imprinted in our collective memory. But like all things born from the fires of creation, Rome was not immune to decay. The city that had once ruled the known world now found itself slipping into the shadows of its past, its once vibrant streets growing still and silent. The papacy, once its unshakable foundation, began to fracture, leading the Pope to leave for Avignon in 1309. This was the beginning of a long, slow departure, a shift that would unmoor the city from its spiritual and political zenith. The loss of the papacy was but one of the many blows that struck Rome during this dark period. The city that had once been the crossroads of the world now became a battleground of greed and pride. The noble families, long rivals, turned their ambition into open warfare. Towers sprouted in every direction as they waged brutal feuds, and the city's very foundations trembled beneath the weight of their conflict. In time, even the people of Rome, the very lifeblood of the city, began to fade. The grandeur of the past was overshadowed by the cruelty of the present. The scent of decay lingered in the air, as the great structures of the city, once symbols of Rome's eternal power, crumbled into the dust of history. Then came the plague, a merciless visitor that swept through the city with devastating force, claiming the lives of the young and the old, the rich and the poor. It was as if Rome, long the center of the world, had become an empty shell, hollowed out by disease and despair. The markets, the temples, the streets that had once been teeming with life were now silent, broken by death's cruel hand. Yet, even as the great city seemed to fade away, its spirit endured. In the quiet streets, in the ruins that whispered of greatness, the legacy of Rome remained. The city may have been broken, but it was not forgotten. The fall of Rome was not the end of its story, but the beginning of another, a tale of resilience, of survival, of a city that, despite its many trials, could never truly die. This is the story of that fall, a tale told not through grandiose battles or heroic triumphs, but through the eyes of those who lived through it, who witnessed the slow unraveling of a civilization, and who, despite everything, refused to let the city's soul be extinguished. The fall of Rome was not a singular event, but a series of moments, each one carrying the weight of 1,000 years of history. It was a city slipping from its former glory, not in a blaze of destruction, but in a quiet surrender to time. Yet even in its decline, Rome never ceased to breathe, its heartbeat echoing through the centuries, waiting for a time when the light would return. Chapter 1: When the Pope rode away. The sun had long passed its zenith as it hung like a weary eye above the horizon, casting its amber glow over the cobblestone streets of Rome. There was a stillness, a deep, aching quietness that seemed to hang over the city, as if the very air held its breath. It was a Rome slipping away from its former self. In the distance, the silver domes of St. Peter's Basilica gleamed faintly in the late afternoon light, a beacon of something once sacred but now withering, like a dream slowly fading in the dusk of reality. I, too, felt that loss, one that is subtle at first, like the quiet fading of a beloved tune. I had seen the Pope ride away only a few days ago, leaving behind his magnificent palaces, his scrolls of decrees, and the countless flocks of pilgrims who had once filled the streets of this city with a hum of devotion. The procession was grand, though there was a strange hollow in it, something missing, something unspoken in the great beauty of it. The horses' hooves drummed steadily on the streets, but the people, oh, the people were fewer now. I remember the smell of dust, sweat, and the sharp scent of fresh tallow from the nearby candlemakers, lingering as if the very earth had absorbed the absence of something vital. Rome had always been a city of many faces, but now, it seemed to wear the heavy mask of a forgotten past. I had been there when it happened, standing by the aqueducts near the Forum, my hands pressed against the rough stone of the pillar as I watched. The Pope's horse had pranced by, adorned with gold and crimson, but I saw no light in his eyes, no fire of zeal. It was as if he had been leading not just a procession, but a funeral march. There were whispers in the air, rippling through the crowds like a gentle wind, about Avignon, about the move of the papacy so far from Rome. They called it the Babylonian captivity, but all I could feel was the slow, suffocating withdrawal of Rome's soul. Rome had been the center of the known world, the heart of the church, the seat of authority and faith. The Pope, for centuries, had ruled from this city with a blend of divine right and earthly power, his influence felt even in the most remote corners of the empire. But now, the fragile threads that once held this city of marble and stone together were unraveling. It wasn't just the Pope who had left, it was a whole way of life, a sense of purpose, as though the city had forgotten its own heartbeat. I often walked the narrow streets of the Trastevere district during those days, where the cobblestones were worn smooth by centuries of feet. The scent of roasting meat and freshly baked bread would hang in the air, mingling with the distant notes of a lute being played by a street musician. But even here, there was a sense of something amiss. The people were still smiling, still living, but there was a weariness in their eyes, a quiet resignation that spoke of something deeper than hunger or hardship. And perhaps it was hunger, after all, that had worn the edges of Rome's spirit. Not the kind that gnaws at your belly, but the gnawing hunger of power, power slipping through fingers like sand. When the Pope rode away, so too did much of Rome's strength. The great families of the city, once sworn to protect and honor the church, now sought their fortunes elsewhere. Merchants from Florence and Milan grew richer, and the streets that once echoed with the chatter of scholars and theologians now buzzed with the footfalls of bankers and traders. But Rome did not die, not yet. It still stood with its stubborn dignity, its ruins speaking of a time when emperors ruled and the city itself had been the crown of the world. I often found myself in the quiet corners of the city, standing before broken columns and crumbling arches, pondering what had become of this place that had once seemed eternal. The marble had long since turned gray, but beneath the patina of time, there was still a flicker of the old brilliance. It was then that I met Antonella, a young woman whose family had lived in Rome for generations. She was born in the shadow of the great basilicas, her eyes wide with the knowledge of the city's past but tempered by the somber understanding of its present. "It is not the city, but the soul of it that is leaving," she said one evening, as we stood beside the Tiber, watching the current pull the debris of the day towards the sea. Her voice was soft, like the rustle of leaves in the autumn wind. I turned to her, startled by the clarity of her words. "What do you mean?" She smiled faintly, the dim light of the evening catching the curve of her lips. "Rome has always lived on memory. But memories fade, and what is left is a shadow of what once was." Her words lingered with me, not as a lament but as a quiet acceptance. Rome was not gone, but it was becoming something else, a city in transition, neither fully alive nor fully dead, somewhere between the past and the future. As the years rolled on, the Pope never returned. The city became quieter still, as if it was learning to live without the weight of its former glory. But in the quiet, I began to see something else, an aching beauty, as though the very act of survival, of standing on the edge of oblivion and still reaching for the light, was a form of grace. I would not see Rome in the same way again. The city had begun to change, and so had I. The light of the past was dimming, but it was not yet gone. And I knew, somehow, that in the darkness, there would always be a glimmer of something sacred, something eternal, even if it was only in memory. Chapter 2, Towers and Ashes. The wind had begun to change in Rome, not just in the air but in the very bones of the city itself. The towering structures, once proud symbols of might and faith, now seemed to lean slightly inward, as though bowing their heads in reverence or surrender to something that neither time nor kings could alter. In the 10 years since the Pope had left, Rome had transformed again, though it was more like a ruin being rebuilt from its own dust, a city that clung desperately to the bones of a history too heavy to bear. I wandered the streets often now, my feet taking me without purpose through the narrow alleys and wide, empty piazzas. The clang of the smiths' hammers, the faint murmur of monks in their robes, and the occasional clatter of carts pushed by the poor, these sounds filled the air, but beneath them was a strange quiet, a subtle despair that touched everything. Rome was still alive, still breathing, but it was a weakened pulse, a slow, tired heartbeat. It was not only the Pope's absence that had left its mark, It was the rise of the towers, the great stone structures that now rose like silent sentinels across the city. The noble families of Rome, who had once been bound by common faith, had become like warring tribes, each seeking to carve out a kingdom for themselves. The towers were the symbols of their new power, fortresses of stone rising higher and higher into the sky, sharp and jagged against the horizon. I remember the first time I saw one of these towers, rising abruptly from a street I had walked 100 times. It was a strange thing, this tower, not like the soft, rounded domes and columns of the old temples, but harsh and angular, a thing that demanded attention, that dared the world to notice. The building was both a symbol of defiance and a monument to fear, a thing that cast long, cold shadows over the city. They were built quickly, as though the families feared that without such a stark assertion of power, they would vanish into the dust like so many others before them. The streets beneath these looming structures were a tangle of whispers and half-silence. The tower builders, mostly wealthy merchants and feudal lords, were seen as the new aristocracy. They had money, influence, and a hunger for control that stretched far beyond Rome. They had their own armies, their own laws, their own sense of justice. Each tower was an island, a statement, a declaration that they were untouchable, unreachable by the city that once had reigned supreme. Yet there was an irony in this: those who sought to protect their power with towering walls were also the ones most vulnerable to the cracks forming beneath their feet. The city was a living thing, its pulse slowing, its people worn thin by uncertainty. A new darkness was creeping into the corners of the ancient city, fed by greed, betrayal, and ambition. The city's soul had been fractured, and no matter how high the towers rose, they could not shield the inhabitants from the emptiness that settled over them. I met Beatrice during these years, a woman whose family had once been noble, but now was swallowed by the same hunger for dominance that consumed the rest. She lived in one of the towers, a cold, imposing structure of stone and iron, where the light hardly ever seemed to touch the walls. She had inherited the title of her family, but her heart was burdened with more than the weight of her name. "We've made ourselves prisoners in these towers," she told me one evening, her fingers tracing the cold, smooth surface of the stone window ledge as we looked out over the city. "We think we've built them to protect us, but in truth, we've built them to keep us separate. We've sealed ourselves away from the life below, from the heart of Rome itself." Her words lingered in the air between us, like the faint scent of smoke from a dying fire. I wondered if she realized just how much she had in common with the city. There was a fragility in her voice, something that hinted at a loss of faith, a loss of purpose, just as Rome was losing its faith in its own divinity. The city felt like a place caught between two worlds, caught between its past and its future, between the eternal glory it had once known and the harsh, crumbling present. The once great buildings of Rome, with their intricate carvings and grand arches, were now coated in soot and ash, their beauty fading under the relentless weight of time. One evening, I stood before the Colosseum, watching the sun as it set behind the broken arches. The great amphitheater, once a place of revelry and bloodshed, now stood as a solemn monument to a time long past. The crowds that had once filled its seats had long gone, replaced by birds that fluttered around the ruins and the occasional beggar who sought shelter from the cold. It was a melancholy sight, this empty shell of a monument, as if the city had forgotten its own power and glory. I met a man there one afternoon, an old historian who seemed as ancient as the ruins themselves. He had spent his life studying the rise and fall of empires, the ebb and flow of power, and when I asked him about the state of Rome, he sighed deeply. "Rome is a city that remembers too much," he said, his eyes distant, as if looking into some faraway time. "It remembers the triumphs, the victories, the days when it ruled the world. But what it forgets is that even the greatest empire must someday fall. And so, Rome stands now not as a city, but as a ghost of what it once was, haunted by its own memory." His words struck me deeply, but I was not sure whether he spoke of Rome itself or of us all, of the people who still clung to this place like moths to a dying flame. But even as the towers rose higher and the ashes of the past clung to the city's soul, there was something in the air, a subtle promise of change. Rome was not dead, not yet. And in the quiet hours of the evening, when the last golden rays of light faded and the night enveloped the city in its soft, silken embrace, I could almost hear it, the faint whisper of a new beginning. Something was stirring beneath the dust, beneath the silence, waiting to rise again. Chapter 3, The Year of Empty Thrones. By the time the year 1330 had drawn its first breath, the city of Rome had begun to feel like a story that no longer had an author, like a canvas abandoned midway through a painting. The grand, crumbling arches and marble pillars, remnants of ancient triumphs, now seemed more like ghosts than monuments. They loomed over the city, fractured and silent, holding their secrets close, hiding the weight of time in their cracked surfaces. The streets that had once thrummed with the vibrant pulse of life now whispered only in echoes, like a forgotten song lingering in the corners of memory. It was in these years, the years after the great towers rose and the Pope's exile to Avignon stretched on, that the air began to change. There was an unmistakable heaviness to it, as though Rome had drawn its final breath and now existed only in the shadow of something lost. The great city, once the seat of power, no longer ruled, no longer stood as the center of Christendom. And yet, there was something almost tragic in its persistence, a city that refused to die, even as the world seemed to move away from it. I wandered more now, restless, unsettled, seeking something that I could not name. The streets were empty, even in the daytime. The market stalls, once brimming with the fresh fruits and vegetables of the Roman countryside, had become little more than memories. Only a few merchants still ventured out to sell their wares, and their eyes told stories of hardship and struggle, stories of a Rome they had once loved, but no longer recognized. The throne of Rome itself was vacant, not by accident, but by the weight of history, the weight of a century-long absence of the papacy. The Pope's seat had not been occupied in Rome for nearly 70 years. It was a void that the city could not fill, a silence that rang louder than any bells. The people still looked up to the distant land of Avignon, across the Alps, where the Pope now resided, but the connection was faint, like a thread that could barely hold the fabric of the city together. I met Cecilia in these years, a woman who had lived through the early days of Rome's decline and watched as the city shrank from its grand vision of the world to something more fragile, more tentative. She was born into a family of great wealth, though their fortune had long since dwindled, as had the standing of most of Rome's old nobility. Like so many, she had been forced to retreat into the walls of her family's palace, a quiet and empty place in the heart of the city. I found her one evening, standing alone in the garden, her eyes turned toward the distant hills as the golden hour wrapped the world in a tender glow. "I used to believe in Rome," she said to me one afternoon as we walked beneath the ancient walls, the soft sound of our footsteps the only noise that seemed to belong to this place anymore. "I used to believe that it would always be, that it would rise from the ashes like a phoenix." She paused, looking down at her hands, as if unsure of how to continue. "But now it feels like we're just waiting for something that will never come." Her words carried with them a quiet sadness, but also a sort of weary wisdom. She wasn't the first person I had met who spoke of Rome in this way. Everywhere I went, I saw it reflected in the faces of the people, a longing, a desire for something that they could no longer reach. Rome had always been a city of grand expectations, of empire, of faith, of glory. But what happens when all those things slip away, leaving only the weight of what came before? The days seemed to stretch on endlessly during these years. The Tiber, once a vibrant life force that pulsed through the heart of the city, now ran sluggishly, its waters dark and murky, the surface littered with debris. It mirrored the spirit of the people, uncertain, heavy, burdened. The eternal city had become a place of silence, of waiting. The people spoke of a time when the Pope might return, when the throne of Street Peter might once again be filled with the light of divine authority, but even these whispers felt hollow. The great patriarchs of the Church had not only left the city physically, they had taken with them the very soul of Rome. The year 1347 came, bringing with it the promise of change, or perhaps the culmination of years of waiting. It was the year that Rome began to feel its greatest fear, the fear that had hovered over the city for so long like a shadow, an empty throne, not only within the Vatican but within the city itself, was a throne that could not be filled with anything less than divinity. And then the plague came. I remember the first word of it, how it traveled through the streets on the whispers of the poor. It came from the farthest reaches of the east, they said, carried by the winds and the rats that scurried beneath the stone of the city. At first, it seemed like a distant thing, something that happened in faraway lands. But it was not long before the first cases appeared, quiet, unseen at first, like a slow tide creeping across the land. And then, it swept through the city like wildfire, claiming the lives of the rich and poor alike, spreading across every street and corner, every home and household. I watched as the city fell into chaos, as the markets closed and the people retreated into their homes, locking their doors and bolting their windows. The streets, once filled with the voices of Rome's citizens, became eerily silent. The towers, those very symbols of power and fear, now stood empty, their windows dark and lifeless, reflecting the sickness that had spread across the land. I saw Cecilia again during these days, her face pale, her eyes hollow, as she stood at the threshold of her family's home, gazing out at the world that seemed to have shifted irrevocably. "This is the end of Rome," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, as if she were speaking not to me, but to the city itself. "And this time, there will be no rising." I didn't know how to respond. It was as if the city had already begun its slow, inevitable descent into the history books, a place to be remembered in legends but no longer lived in. The plague took the lives of so many, and in its wake, it left only emptiness. Rome had always been a city of eternal light. But as I stood there in the streets, watching the plague rip through the city like an unstoppable force, I couldn't help but feel that the light had finally, irrevocably, begun to fade. Chapter 4: The Plague of the Living. The air had thickened in Rome, heavy with the weight of things left unsaid, of grief that had no voice, no sound. The city had become a place of shadows, and the shadows themselves seemed to grow longer with each passing day, stretching like an unholy omen across the cracked cobblestones. The plague had not been a visitor, not a brief storm to weather, but a permanent companion, walking alongside the people as they stumbled through the crumbling streets. We had all been witnesses to its slow march, and yet no one could remember a time before it had arrived, before it had stained the very soul of the city. I moved through Rome in the days that followed, in the wake of the plague's first strike. The once thriving markets were now empty, their stalls overturned, their wares rotting under the weight of time and neglect. There was no song, no laughter, no chattering of voices that once made the streets hum with life. Now there was only a deep, unbearable silence, broken only by the occasional cry or the sound of the distant bells tolling, their solemn notes resonating through the city like a funeral dirge. I had never seen Rome so still, and I knew, in the pit of my stomach, that this stillness was something that could never be undone. The plague had taken everything, had stolen the joy, the faith, the very essence of life. And with each life it claimed, the city seemed to shrink, becoming more and more a shadow of its former self. The stones, the temples, the towers, everything seemed to whisper of what was gone, of what had been lost forever. I saw the people now, those few who remained, in ways I had never seen them before. They had become walking specters, eyes hollow, faces gaunt, their movements slow and shuffling. The color had drained from the city, not just from the walls and buildings but from the very faces of its people. It was as though the plague had stolen not only their lives but also their ability to dream, to hope. There was no more light in their eyes, no more laughter in their voices. Rome had become a place of mourning, a place where the living barely clung to the edges of their own existence. I found myself in the city's heart one evening, standing before the crumbling ruins of the Forum. It was a place I had visited often, in the past, filled with awe and reverence for its history. But now, as the last rays of the sun fell across the ancient stones, it seemed only a monument to loss, to time passing without mercy. The air was thick with the scent of decay, of old stone, of forgotten glories, of the dust of centuries. And yet, there was something else in the air, something I could not place, something that made the silence seem even more profound. I remembered the words of Antonella, the woman I had met all those years ago, standing beside the Tiber as she spoke of Rome's fading soul. It had felt like a quiet truth then, a gentle sadness, a loss I could almost bear. But now, as I stood among the ruins, it felt like a finality. The city's spirit was gone. What was left was not Rome, but only the memory of it, like a shadow cast by the setting sun. I met Celeste during these days, a woman who had once been part of the city's vibrant intellectual circles, a scholar whose knowledge had once been sought by kings and nobles. She had lived in the heart of Rome, among the great thinkers and the scholars who had kept the city's flame alive through its darkest moments. But now, like so many others, she had retreated, no longer teaching, no longer sharing her knowledge, but hiding in the silence of her own thoughts. "There is no more Rome," she said one evening, her voice thin and trembling. "We are the last remnants of it, the last of the flame that once burned so brightly. But now there is only the ash." Her words struck me, not because they were new, but because they were true in a way that felt like a knife to the heart. I had seen the city crumble, seen it fade from its former glory into something unrecognizable. But to hear someone say it so plainly, to name the emptiness, made the truth feel final, irreversible. The weeks that followed were like a blur, one long, gray stretch of days, each one indistinguishable from the next. The plague showed no mercy, its shadow sweeping through the city without hesitation, claiming lives in its wake. It was no longer a distant threat, it had become a presence, an entity that lived among us. It was in the streets, in the walls of the homes, in the very air we breathed. There were no more funerals, no more mourners. The dead were buried quickly, without ceremony, without rites. Their names were lost to the wind, their faces erased from memory. I wandered the streets, sometimes alone, sometimes with Celeste or other remnants of the past, but always with the feeling that the city was slipping away, piece by piece, until there would be nothing left. I saw the last of the great towers, the stone walls of the noble families, abandoned and decaying, their windows dark and empty, reflecting the emptiness of the streets. The city had become a ghost town, a place where the echoes of what had been whispered in the wind but could no longer be heard. There was no salvation in sight, no hope that Rome would rise again. The plague had taken more than lives, it had taken the city's soul, its reason for being. And yet, as I stood on the steps of the great basilicas, as I looked at the broken statues of saints and angels, I could not help but feel something strange, a flicker of something deeper than despair. Perhaps it was the knowledge that even in the midst of this death, even in the silence that had consumed the city, there was something enduring. I thought of the ruins, of the stones that had withstood the centuries, of the shadows of the past that still clung to the streets. There was no going back, no undoing the damage that had been done. But perhaps, in time, the ashes would settle, and something new would rise from them, something shaped not by the glory of the past but by the resilience of the human spirit. Rome was no longer a city of power, no longer the heart of the world. It had become a place of endings, a place where the past and the present converged in a quiet, painful harmony. The plague had not simply taken lives, it had taken the very essence of what made Rome eternal. But even as the city lay broken, even as the light dimmed and the world moved on, I could not shake the feeling that somewhere, deep within the ruins, the soul of Rome still lingered, waiting for the day when the light would return. And perhaps, just perhaps, that day would come.